Welcome to Catholic in America, and today our topic is on social justice.
Today we're going to be talking about the modern trend towards social justice, the rejection of that, and then also what the Catholic response is.
So calling all social justice warriors and just straight up justice warriors and everything in between, because this is the show for you. Hey guys, so we're talking about social justice today. So if that gets you already angry, you're watching the right show. You just hear that word. I'm Father Michael Nixon, joined by Father Tom Dillon, Father Doug Martin, as always. And we're excited you guys are watching today. So make sure you like, share, and subscribe. That helps us to get this to a lot of other people. Yeah. So social justice, guys. What's kind of the popular mindset towards this trend, towards, huge corporations that support it, many people that hate it? What is this kind of rooted in? And then we can start to kind of tease this out a little bit more.
Well, the good thing is it's not very controversial. I mean, no one's really bothered by it. So no,
everyone they saw social justice and they immediately said, "I like this video." I don't even know what these guys are going to say. They liked it. And they just
they
warm thoughts towards us. People would look, they're like, oh, I like these guys more.
They're warm and fuzzy. Yeah, I mean, man, I don't know. There's so many polarizing issues right now in our society, but I don't know if there's one more polarizing than this one. Just because
it encapsulates all of them.
All of them. It takes all those issues that are polarized and put them into one place. Word. And then what's funny is whoever, if you're demonizing someone for it, you can conveniently place all those things you don't like in it. Mm-hmm. And if you really like it and enjoy it, you can conveniently take all the bits and pieces that you like and put it into your little social justice box. And so, I mean, I think that's part of the issue here is what it actually is and what it actually should be. And I think it's kind of like opinions. You would get a different response from different people. And I think that's part of the problem that we have with this is what people actually think of it and what they actually would call it.
I remember some years ago, Glenn Beck, who's a very popular conservative commentator, he said something to the effect of, this is pre-Trump, this is pre-lots of things. He said something to the effect of if your church talks about social justice, get out of there as soon as you possibly can, because it's. I remember kind of being sort of like puzzled by that, because we'll get into Catholic social teaching, where the term Catholic social justice in the Catholic context, or social justice in the Catholic context comes up, and I was like, what is he talking about? Like that seems so strange. And now that's kind of almost like a mainstream conservative thought, while there's a mainstream liberal thought of social justice, activism. All these things are how you're a good person in our society too. So I didn't really see that this was as controversial as he saw it then, and definitely how I think everybody sees it now. Because you're basically so kind of social justice as popularly understood, that this is what are the social causes for the ills in society. Is that more, the social political structures, maybe that's a lot of times how this is popular said, that have caused the ills in society. Yeah. So we have people that are poor, we have people that are illiterate, people that are in prison, people that are immigrants, people that are discriminated against, people that suffer. There's so many ills in society, and finding, and this is the popular understanding of social justice, finding the root causes of those in societal structures, and how do we change those in order to make the world a better place. Is that a pretty good, pretty fair summation of it?
Yeah, I don't think that most people are actually opposed to social justice. What they're opposed to is the solutions.
Yes.
Yes. Like, I don't think anyone's opposed to, I mean, you have to be a moron to be opposed to poverty.
Right.
I'm opposed to poverty. I'm opposed to all the different things that we see. The question is, like, what are the solutions? And
Absolutely.
And that's where most people get really frustrated. Because is my solution motivated by a capitalistic outlook on life? Is my solution motivated by a communistic or a socialistic,
libertarian,
or like, do I have Republican views on Democratic views? Like, what's
conservative?
Conservative, correct. Sure, the question is, like, what are the solutions to these problems? I think that everyone recognizes the reality of the problems. I mean, maybe I should rewind that. Some people want to say that there are also some of the issues that we say are social justice problems are not social justice problems. Like that's not actually a problem, which then gets people really hot. So for instance, is abortion, is abortion a moral issue, or is abortion actually a social justice issue?
Right.
And that's
both.
Or both, exactly. And that's where things get hot very quickly, because then you want to say that, well, these, obviously no one disagrees that poverty is an issue, but then the question is, do people recognize that abortion is a social justice issue? So
right, and again, that depends on what your social justice box is, and that's kind of garnered by your worldview, and it's kind of changes by what you think politically lots of times, what you think morally even. I mean, what's in that box just kind of changes by person to person. That's what I meant by it becomes another subjective thing that we're dealing with that you see people it can be. That's right. But I think in the outworking of it right now in society for the most part, that's what it is. It is a very subjective thing because we don't really have a good handle on what it is.
So zooming in on this a little bit, justice, I think kind of, a very bland, it could be a much more nuanced definition. A bland definition of justice is receiving what you're owed. What is your due? So, that having air, breathing, food, water, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
Go America, right?
Now it's being said healthcare.
So we'll get to that because lots of things added onto it. But so justice is getting what is your due. Social justice then becomes like a kind of the social things around this. So that if I'm fighting for social justice, I'm fighting all the social issues. Then that gets into healthcare, that gets into education, that gets into to family structures, that gets into government structures that support or deny the people receiving what is their due. So on a very, very basic level, so then the question that becomes, are we in favor of social justice or not? And maybe to ask the people at home, maybe ask this question of yourself, because I've heard so many commentators that have made very strong cases where you're a good person because you're in favor of these social justice issues. And the ones that have come up a lot recently that I think are very valid, have very important conversations about policy and everything else, about racism or about climate change or about like all these sort of things. Immigration, all these things are worthy of having deep conversations about. And basically your worth and value, whether you're a good or bad person, is the stance you take towards these issues, which is really, really interesting because this is rooted, actually, there's a lot of biblical roots to these things. Right. But we're going to figure it out maybe we as a society have gone astray. So the reason why people are so crazy about this, and maybe I'll hand this over to you guys. Why do you think people get so angry about this, whether in favor of social justice causes or against social justice causes, and the stances that people take, even by their silence?
I think some of it is just...
why am I so angry, Doug?
Right. Well, I think some of it is probably because of ignorance and of being able to label something out of ignorance. I mean, I think that we don't understand what social justice is. I mean, we do understand what right and wrong is, and so we can kind of place that into that. But because we've labeled something, a particular thing, so like we've labeled social justice as liberal, well, I can't like that. Even though I may be supporting some of the issues that are actual social issues, I mean, social justice issues, I can't like that term. I don't like the means of going about that, and I'm not going to be associated with that. You're not going to put my name on it, like you said, because if you do, that means I'm a bad person, or I've given in to some system, or I've turned things over. So it's part of it's just ignorance and not being able to label things what they really are, and being able to say, even though that may be a dirty word right now, or it may be, this is a very, virtuous thing and a very virtuous word. For whatever reason, people just are just absolutely either for or against, and it creates the sides that we're seeing. So it's just coming from not, to a certain extent, not knowing that sometimes they're for social justice issues, but they don't want to call it that because of the word.
So, but you're saying ignorance, but I'm hearing even more kind of like possibly like a it's just easier to take a side on this than it is to sort of grapple with the nuance of this as well.
I think that's true too. Yeah.
I think that also the reason why people are crazy about it is because of their experience. So people's experiences, which then turn them into warriors, right? Yeah. So whatever you experience in life forms and shapes your perception on reality. And so if I come from poverty, like, and I've been hurt by poverty, then obviously I'm going to be fighting against poverty. Yeah. Like if I was raised in a family where abortion was talked about regularly, and like I was raised in a pro-life environment where like I was showing up to the clinic with my mom and praying in front of the clinic and seeing this, obviously I'm like, I become very passionate about that. Conversely, I was raised in a pro-abortion home, like where women's rights were being talked about, and like I saw people chanting on the streets and demonizing people as they're walking in. They become very passionate about what they've experienced in life. And I think that, I mean, across the board, like I'm an immigrant, I came here, I have a family member who had a break-in with an immigrant. I mean, you have all these different people who are arguing from their experience. And I think that it's important to recognize like their experience is the valid. Like people experience what they experience, and reality is a reality and experience. But that's the reason why I think that sometimes people become crazed is because they become very passionate about what they've experienced. And that's why to me, like the danger in a lot of the social justice argument is that when we are being motivated by experience as opposed to ideas, and like systems, like that's from a Catholic perspective, like we have a full system in place that way you can analyze the system. That's the difficulty with experientially based decision making and experientially is that I don't know your system. I can't evaluate, and I can't be critical of your. I can't. How am I to be critical of your? How am I to be? But on the other hand, like you do have, and sometimes there's a blend and blur between two, because not everyone is just entirely experientially based. Right. Just as most people who are ideologues are not just entirely. But I mean, it's just, that to me is one of the major reasons why there's so much passion.
Especially in an age of where we're encouraging people to express your truth. You know, what's your truth?
I'm very passionate about that argument.
That's just why I said we.
So I think too, there's and this is a societal move that we're in, this where you're either good or bad. Like that's kind of like you're either good or evil, if you want to say it. It's interesting as we've gotten past religion as a society, we're even more pronounced, it seems, with this like good or evil, where I want to be good, so I take if I'm on the side of this reality, then I'm considered good. And if I'm against that reality, then I'm considered bad. So it's kind of like a convenient way, that I just have to be in favor of something. I don't even have to do anything.
Right.
That I can just be in favor of a cause or against a cause.
I can like it.
And I can like it.
No, I like it. You did something. I like it.
Or I can put a frowny face to it. I don't like it.
Right. By the way, like, share, and subscribe.
That's right. Please like, share, and subscribe. Or put a frowny face. So there's something within that in a sense, like in years past, in order to become a good person, you had to grow in virtue.
Yeah.
And it's hard work to become a good person. Now I just say, I'm in favor of this thing, and I'm a good person. And those people that guy over there is not in favor of that thing. He's a bad person. So it becomes this easy sort of dividing point that, in a sense, it gives us the satisfaction of being virtuous without actually having to become virtuous too. So I think that's definitely at play in this as well. So I want to break down a little bit kind of the history of this, and particularly how the church has responded to it as well. Because this isn't something entirely new. These struggles, and so continue with us for this conversation on social justice in the Catholic Church. We'll see you in just a second. Hey guys, thanks for checking out Catholic in America. I'm Father Michael Nixon, and I like to party.
And I am Father Tom Dillon, priest here in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee. I think I have the longest hair in probably the state, and I too like to party. I like whiskey and cigars.
Father Doug Martin. I'm also a priest here in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, and I'm married and roll tide.
Oh my goodness. Yes, sir. I was okay with the being married part, but the whole tide thing. In Catholic in America, we engage the intersection between faith and culture.
Tune in every week because no topic is out of bounds.
We want to thank you so much for supporting this show by watching it, by liking, sharing, and subscribing. How else can they support the show?
You can also become a patron on Patreon and support us financially.
So if you support us, there's all kinds of swag. There's t-shirts, there's coffee mugs, or maybe bumper stickers. I don't know. Maybe we could come up with a wig from Father Tom.
Father Tom wig would go a long way. So thanks for your support. God bless y'all, and check us out next time on Catholic in America. Welcome back to Catholic in America. We are talking about a non-controversial issue, social justice today.
Everybody agrees on it.
And please like, share, and subscribe.
And also, if you would, please support us on Patreon. And
Yes.
really, we would accept any way you can support us, because if you like the content that you're seeing and you would like to to be able to share it, one way is to like, share, and subscribe, but another way is to support us monetarily. So even $5 really does help us. Of course, $100 helps more, but whatever you can do to support us monetarily, we would really appreciate that.
Super grateful to that. If you want to put some Bitcoin down on us, or however people support us on Patreon, is great. So let's kind of dive into sort of the foundations of this, because there are ills in society. There are societal ills, and there are injustices at a social level, and so recognizing that is important. The biblical foundations of dealing with social ills, of societal problems, of injustice is pretty profound. And I think I'll start in the Old Testament, and you guys can kind of dip into wherever you want, like looking at that the constant word of the Lord to the people of Israel is how you're judged by how you treat widows, orphans, and the alien. The
little green men.
The immigrant, huh?
Oh, the immigrants, okay.
The little green men.
Not
aliens. So this is the thing, guys. So that was, in a sense, you're judged by that. No matter what your sacrifices are, no matter what all these sorts of things that God would say, like, I don't listen to your words of prayer because you mistreat the poor, you mistreat the widows, the orphans, and the immigrants. I would say too that those three kind of categories of persons are still the ones who are trampled upon today. That our social justice needs to be looking towards. So anyway, recognizing how deep of a profound concern this has been, it's legislated throughout the whole, through Exodus, through Leviticus, through Numbers, about the way that you treat these people, and then it carries on, especially into the prophets.
And the judgment that happens afterwards when they don't. I mean, that really is a large part of what happens, throughout the prophets, and what you see happening in a lot of the Old Testament itself is when they are and when they're not treating them very well. I think going obviously to Jesus' own teaching as well. I mean, it not only followed this teaching in the Old Testament, but it ratified it and stamped it that this is the way you love God, and this is the way that you love your neighbor as well. And to fulfill the commandments, these are the things that you have to do to love the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant, the alien, those who are outside of where we are. And of course, it has a gospel flavor to it, but I think that's sometimes the kind of the low-hanging fruit is just that we're sharing the gospel and we're making it a more spiritual thing. When Jesus was very clear, this isn't just a spiritual issue. It is a spiritual issue, but this is something that we do. It comes from it. I'm reminded of when Pope Francis, someone asked him, how does charity work? And he said, well, you pray for the poor and then you feed them. And that's how prayer works. The whole idea that spirituality and the actual doing of something are primary to it. And we see that in the Beatitudes, we see it in other parts of the Gospels themselves, and Jesus being very much at the forefront of that.
I mean, you also go back to the second story in Scripture, which is the story of Cain and Abel, the two sons of Adam and Eve, that as continuation of the theme of stewardship and the loss of stewardship and the corruption of stewardship. Adam and Eve, who are the gardens, the stewards of creation, who then in their selfishness become the tyrants of creation. And then this plays out in the lives of their two sons, their two first. Cain, who is called to offer and be generous and to give the first fruits, and Abel, who's called to be generous and give the first fruits. And that notion of Cain's stinginess, his lack of generosity and his giving what was left over, versus Abel, who gives the first fruits. And then like this tragic and sad story is obviously that Cain his sacrifice is rejected because he's not giving from a generous heart. God rejects his sacrifice as a discipline, but also as a teaching moment. And Cain, I'm not taking your leftovers. That's where he sees. But Cain, because of the corruption of his own heart, he goes and sees that his brother's is accepted, and that's when he takes Abel out into the field and slays him in the field with the famous story. But that's where kind of that echoing voice of Cain, where we have him as God then confronts him with the evils of what he's done to his brother. And then this famous rejection from Cain, am I my brother's keeper? I'm in this rejection of this brotherly, of this affection, which then echoes into kind of the story. If you see a parallel, you can see I would see a parallel clearly with the story of Lazarus and Ives in the New Testament, of the rich man who sees his brother and never recognizes his brother because his brother's the stranger, Lazarus, who's like the
poor man at the door.
Yeah, the poor man at the door. And so that's where eventually he ends up in hell, burning in hell. And then, but the funny thing about the story of Rich Man and Ives, the Rich Man, Ives, and Lazarus, is that even in hell, he still sees Lazarus as a tool, as a means to his end. Because he's just like, send Lazarus to dip his finger and then to come and quench my thirst. And he still his perspective, like Cain's, never changes. And so it's not just in the taking care of the needs of others, it's about this rejection of relationship, which is also found in the Old Testament, is that when you reject relationship, when you are greedy and you reject relationship with your brother, it lends out into these atrocious acts within society and within the family, and the family then spreads to society.
Right. Well, then you even look in the New Testament, in the epistles, the letters that are written there. Paul talks about, be careful to take care of the widows and the orphans, and you hear James talking about how you treat your brother how
you are your brother's keeper.
You are your brother's keeper. You don't put your poor brothers at your foot, or you don't give them the worst seats in the house. For the rich to be treated that way. That we're to treat all people with the dignity and the respect that they're due.
I mean, in a very simple, crass way. I mean, it's like God's like, don't be a suck up to me.
Right.
If you're treating your sibling like garbage, don't come to me and tell me and kiss me on my face and tell me that you love me when you are treating these people. Right. And we are one common human family.
Well, and then the idea too, borrowing on that, the idea too that Jesus says, if you've done it to them, you've done it to me.
Matthew 25.
Matthew 25, the judgment of the nations. Again, it's one of those readings, every time I read it, it's a terrifying reading. And it's something I think we need to, sometimes we make Jesus this kind of cosmic nice guy.
Yeah.
He talks about the judgment of the nations. And basically we're judged by how you treat the poor.
Yep.
Like that becomes the divine line. And it's rooted in too, this is every page of Scripture, is that man and woman, humanity, were made in the image and likeness of God. So we're divine image bearers. So in a sense, the way that we treat each other and the way that we build up society, that's what gets into the social aspect of this, is not unimportant. It's not just this kind of Darwinistic survival of the fittest that we can fall into. And that's something politically that kind of like falls into, in a sense, we can be like, I'm religious, but politics is not, is this other thing. And it's almost like an atheistic thing. But as Christians, we recognize that this should imbue all stages and all levels of society, the dignity of the human person, the lifting up, the betterment of my brother and sister, and that requires sacrifice, that requires generosity, it requires creativity, all sorts of things. But it's on every page of Scripture, and we definitely see it. It goes from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Yeah. So if you thought you could get away without taking care of the poor, without taking care of the worker, that's another thing that comes up a lot in the Old Testament is you give worship to me and you withhold wages from the worker. I'm not listening to your prayer. Right. If you thought those who are imprisoned or sick, or those who are young, or those who are elderly, it's essential. It's not an add-on to following Jesus.
And one of the things I've been told, at least when we start talking about the poor and those who are disadvantaged, is that they'll throw out the phrase that Jesus said that was, we will always have them with you. Mm-hmm. Almost like, well, I mean, that's just a common problem. I mean, and don't worry too much about it. They'll always be there, no matter what you do. And so it's almost...
That's why God is always giving us something to do.
That's right. Yeah, but it's almost as if that's an excuse not to do something.
Oh, yeah. Which,
I've often heard that.
If Jesus was with that throwaway line, and that's an important line, if he was undermining everything on every other page of Scripture to say, like, don't worry about taking care of the poor, just accept me as your personal Lord and Savior or something like that. That would be very strange. It would be. You would think he would have put at least underlined that a couple of times. You're like, guys, I know this contradicts every other thing I've said, every parable I've told you, everything the prophets have said. But anyway, I think in a sense, it's very easy for me, for any of us, and this is why we're part of the church. We believe that we read the Bible, we have a personal relationship with Jesus, but it's not private. We're part of the church because it helps to correct us, and this is maybe we can start to get into the church's response to the ills of society and the world, where I can just read this how can I read this Bible so I never have to change?
Right.
So I never have to do anything.
I'm a nice guy.
It's like, that's great. It confirms me in the way I am already.
That's right.
I do think it's important that there's also the counterbalance, which is like, how do I also stand for the poor but not enable?
Right.
Like, how do I, because you also have, obviously, a lot of the people who are poor are mentally ill. A lot of people who are poor find themselves with various different things, which some are brought about by nature or by unfortunate circumstance, but then some are through choice. So like I have a person who, that's where a lot of people, we've all experienced in ministry, people who are just like, well, I don't like taking care of the poor. Like my son-in-law is poor, but he's a crackhead, or he has a cocaine addiction, or he's doing all these things, and now he's poor, and now and I mean, how often does the alcoholic come back to their family and say, I'm poor, and they give a poor sob story?
Right.
Or you see the person...
There's even homeless people that refuse to take a home and would rather live where they are.
60% of people on the streets are homeless or have mental disease. And so, some of that mental disease is through no fault of their own, which is why there's that balance, obviously. But that's the thing, you don't know.
Right.
And then there's this level, which is obviously, okay, I don't know, maybe I'm called to be generous.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you have anyone who's ever struggled with severe addiction and they don't want to change, and you recognize, God himself, also in the Old Testament, sometimes gives people exactly what they want. He allows the rich young man, he allows the prodigal son to go off and to spend his inheritance. He doesn't go off chasing his son, and he doesn't save him from the pig slop. He allows his son to stay in the pig slop until he changed. So there's also that fine balance of how do we find ourselves being generous and taking care of the needs of the disenfranchised and the poor and the widow, the orphan, the stranger.
Sure.
At the same time, how do I stand against enabling moral evils?
See, I want to come back at you with that. I've never been in danger of being too generous. I've never. Maybe you're there a lot. Where you're just like, man, I'm just, giving my bed to crack addicts, and I'm sleeping in the streets. My tendency is towards selfishness. So for me, again, and I think this is particularly when we're talking about family members with addicted, people and stuff. That's maybe where it definitely can play out. But that would be my only. I definitely recognize the point, but I know for myself, I'm so far in one direction towards my own comfort and everything else. So let's talk a little bit about this, because the church has had to, the Word of God, living and effective, has to be incarnated in the world that we're living in. So it's always important to recognize Jesus didn't just give us a book. And be like, hey, here's this book. Try to live it out. See, he founded a church, and it says the churches who gave us the Bible put the Bible together. And throughout the ages, from when the church was a small persecuted minority, to when the church was the official religion of the Roman Empire, to the churches had to embody the Word of God in the way that we care for the poor, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, the little green men. The way that we care for those imprisoned, those who are laborers, those who are wounded and injured, those who addicted, all these things throughout the history of the church. So maybe kind of we can talk. I want to get into Salamanca, because I do want to sound smart by saying that. But from the very beginning, the church is the reason why we have hospitals.
Yeah.
The church, that
still the most charitable organization on the planet of the
Absolutely.
Earth. Yeah.
So there's this recognition of the hospitals, the
orphanages,
the shelters, seeking to meet the needs. Now you can point to all the ways the church hasn't done this well throughout our history,
sure.
and because we've been around for a long time. There's a lot to, but in a sense that we're constantly seeking to be motivated by, we have societal ills. How do we address those? How do we address the root causes as well? That comes to a head with world-shaking events when the New World was discovered, and all of a sudden now we have people that exist on the other side of the world who we didn't know about and might as well have been aliens. When we talk about the Native Americans, both in North and South America, and how we begin to understand as European society how to treat them. And this is where a lot of this social theory begins to emerge. So Salamanca, you were talking a little bit about that
Salamanca. I mean, you had the School of Salamanca in Spain, predominantly, which was influenced and where the Jesuits were. As the Jesuits were, and the Franciscans, the Dominicans, were in the New World and discovering, and all of a sudden now we have new questions, like how do we treat these people who, from the Catholic perspective, were uneducated, at least by European standards, didn't know Christianity, and in many ways, in many of those cultures, and this is obviously, there's a lot of people who get very passionate about like what the conquistadors and what the French and the Spanish did in the New World. Now but on the other hand, from the opposite perspective, they came across a lot of barbarism.
Right.
They came across human sacrifice. They came across like the Mayans, and they came across the Aztecs, and people like champion these civilizations. But there's a lot of problems with the Aztecs. Yeah. I mean, just watch any History Channel thing on the Aztec Empire, and you'll see some things. So they came across, but then they're like, well, these people are acting barbarically in many of these cases, and so like, do we treat them? Do we enslave them? And it was actually the Catholic Church who started tackling these hard issues, and then one of the major schools was in Salamanca in Spain. And so that was especially the Jesuits were saying, no, we can't just take advantage of these people. These people are created in the image and likeness of God. They're the Imago Dei.
Which that was revolutionary, because to encounter a new group of people, in a sense,
you enslave them.
Like I said, aliens.
It's like
jokingly,
a new race almost,
but a new, or not a new species,
right? Species,
like a new species,
better,
basically,
better.
to say that. Yeah. So the popular sentiment was like, these people are less than because they're
savages.
Not.
Well, and that was predominantly the church. Yeah. It was the missionaries in the church who were having to keep the conquistadors and sometimes some of their tendencies to enslave the population at bay and say, no, these people do have basic, and this is where you had the beginnings of the language of, no, these people do have basic human rights because they are human beings. They are not dogs, they're not animals, they might be acting barbarically, but you do have to treat them. Now, the conquistadors and the Spanish and the French, they oftentimes were barbaric themselves, and they did things that they weren't supposed to do. But still, you had the language of basic human rights that started developing in a cohesive way. Like before that, because like it was all Europeans and people from Africa and Asia who all generally speaking knew about each other, and so like there was a general recognition of, okay, we're different cultures, and everyone thought their culture was better. I mean, that's Aristotle's whole point in Greek Hellenization. But still, they recognize, okay, we're all different peoples, but you had this influx of now this whole different continents, 2 continents with people there. And so the question becomes, how do we treat them? Do we treat them as equals, or do we treat them as less than us? And that's why the language that started developing in the church, which then became used by many people around the world, and this is where the language of basic human rights comes out of that School of Salamanca, which then goes into the Protestant Reformation, then it gets into
Enlightenment and everything else starts.
Enlightenment, industrialization, and then you have obviously the document, the first cohesive document that we had in the church was Rerum Novarum.
Yeah, so just a quick word on, 1891, Leo XIII writes a document called Rerum Novarum, which is considered the first major encyclical, which is like a Pope's letter on Catholic social teaching. And Rerum Novarum means of new things. So in a sense, it's responding to the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Cities are exploding. The countrysides are kind of like, everyone's leaving the countrysides because there's poverty, there's starvation. So cities are swelling. There's no rights for workers. Kids are being exploited. So all these sorts of things are happening exciting things on a certain, think of like the rise of technology, which is amazing, how much just the world grew in that time. But then you also have kind of the dark side of that, the shadow side of just the human persons, going back to the foundational aspect of what the Bible teaches about the dignity of the human person, are being trampled upon.
Right.
And that's always been a temptation, but in a sense there's like systems that just sort of trample on people. You get kind of like, the images of the kids working in the factory, dying in dangerous conditions, coal mines. And so there was many movements of how do we respond to this, and this is where a lot of the philosophies that were very atheistic in nature, Marxism basically kind of began to respond to coming on the side of the rights of workers against factories or against but basically that was in full swing, and so the church responded saying like, okay, how do we respond to these new things that are going on in society, and what is a Christian outlook on it? So that's kind of where in the modern age, at least, the application of this really begins to start.
Yeah, I mean, it's with systems, because I mean, you've always had exploitation of people. Mm-hmm. You had slavery, which was in place for a long period of time, but you don't have a systematic exploitation of people until you start having these new socioeconomic things. Because actually, you need workers. Not only because Reverend Navarro didn't just address communism; it also addressed capitalism and the dangers of capitalism, and addressed socialism, the dangers of socialism, and it looked at all the different modern socioeconomic platforms which are being produced. That this is going to be the way in which we're going to solve the problems in the world. Mm-hmm. And the church was actually skeptical of all of them, and has continued to be skeptical of all of them, because at the end of the day, we also look at the human consciousness and human beings in particular. We want something to save us. Yeah. Especially save us from the very real and present evils that we encounter in our daily lives. And that's why everyone, whether people realize or not, everyone wants to be saved. Yeah. Everyone wants to be saved from the condition that we find ourselves in, and that's why the church looked at these different ways in which there was now political philosophies, social philosophies, which are saying this is how we are going. This is what's going to save the world.
Yes. Yeah.
Therefore, you have the rise of a new messianic. You have a political echo, which we're still dealing with today.
And that gets into the social justice that we view today. In a sense, it's a continuation of conversation that's been happening for the past couple hundred years, whether people are aware of it or not. Keyboard warriors and movements and causes. The cause of the day, and that's kind of what we find ourselves in. Like, are you for this? Are you for these rights? Then you're good. But that goes back to a lot of Marxist reflections on real problems. They say, but the solution then becomes, let's change the government structure, because that's what's going to save us. Now, as Catholic Christians, we would say governments are a kind of a necessary evil, if you will, that we need a society, we need people. But also, too, recognizing that's not going to save us,
right?
And that there's the gospel is really the only thing that's ultimately going to save us. But it is the transformation and conversion of hearts. That does involve the transformation of systems as well, to be more just, to be more aware of where people can fall through the cracks. But I think that's one of the challenges that we always face, throughout our history.
And it may be the only way that societies are ever going to really change to be truly just, is for it's people to not just accept the gospel, but to live that out. And so that's where some of the some of the issues that or some of the objections we see as well is that if you're not living out these gospel values, not just in your own personal life as you're dealing with people, but if you're not a part of this group that's doing it, then you're a bad person, as we were talking about earlier. And if you're not fighting for this particular cause with this particular group,
you're not saved.
You're a bad person. You're not saved.
You're not saved.
I mean, and that's when we start talking about good people and bad people, that's really what we're talking about. Not just I don't like you, but and I question your morals, but I question whether you're even human.
Yeah.
I mean, that language, man, if you don't believe that, go on Twitter. That's all you got to do is go on Twitter. I'm just not doing that. But if you want to see it, you go on Twitter and just see what people say about issues that are true social justice type issues, true social teaching type issues, and things that aren't. I mean, things that really are just a cause and not necessarily what we would find or fall into a social justice category, and just how people are treated. I mean,
well, but then you get into the valid question of how do you determine and differentiate between a real social justice issue versus a cause?
Right.
How does it become what is the standard? What is the objective, evaluatable standard that determines the difference between a real social justice issue versus my particular hobby cause?
Right. And that's popularity.
Well, that's the thing. It's like if it becomes defined by the state.
Yeah.
Then it's subjective and relative.
Right.
If it defines by the individual, that's what I'm saying. From a Christian perspective, like what determines social justice is the Ten Commandments.
Right.
What determines social justice is the Beatitudes. What determines social justice is the Scriptures. So we have an objective standard, which you can find right here. But if it becomes dependent upon my personal preferences or what I determine to be a social justice issue, because there's many people who say that there's things in the Scriptures which are, that we would say from our biblical understanding of the Scriptures is like, this is obviously social justice, but people are like, well, that's not a social justice issue to me.
So within since Rerum Novarum, the church has taught a lot more on Catholic social teaching about social justice in the Catholic context. Again, it's different than a socialism, and the church has come out against socialism many times, and definitely against communism, and a lot of its various forms. But how do we think about social ills, and how do we respond to them as Catholic Christians, not just as individuals, but also as part of communities? And so some of the principles I think are helpful to bring out, and there's a lot that could be said about them. But a couple of them, the first one, we mentioned it earlier, for me, is the dignity of the human person.
Yeah.
The inviolability of the human person, which the reason we're against abortion, the reason we're against, we're against most, here in the Western world, most applications of the death penalty.
Euthanasia.
The reason we're against euthanasia is because of the inherent dignity and worth of the human person. So that again, we can't have any other social justice movements if we're saying, well, these people can be killed.
Right.
These people are expendable.
So important.
Which also goes back to the Fifth Commandment.
Yeah. When we talk about the foundations upon which this must be built, recognizing we can have all the conversations we want about societal ills, but if we're okay with certain members of society, particularly the most vulnerable and most defenseless and most innocent, being discarded and right out killed, then, like, in a sense, we've got no legs to stand on. So I think that's a really important foundation for us to always come back to. And it comes from the biblical narrative, but also recognizing, too, as a society, it's surprising how easy it becomes to say, for the sake of convenience, which people can be exterminated
or expense. Convenience and expense.
Every human life, and human life is dependent upon, is it human? Every human life is created in the image and likeness of God and has equal value. And so it doesn't matter if it's in the womb, it doesn't matter if it's on death's door, it doesn't matter if it's in a prison, it doesn't matter if it's out in the free world. Every human life is created in the image and likeness of God. But it's the second principle that the church has laid out, also extremely biblical, is that when we are dealing with a question between two goods, so two lives, I have two lives which are of equal value and equal worth, because the unborn life is the same value as the person on death row, right?
Yeah.
Because these are both created in the image and likeness of God, and neither of them has greater value, yet there's a preferential option. And this is where we find from the Scriptures, is that we are to prefer and we give priority to the more vulnerable and to the person who's most vulnerable. This is what the church refers to as the preferential option for the poor. And so the preferential option for the poor is that when you have a choice between two goods, but therefore you have to make a choice, which am I going to prefer? That's why it says in the New Testament, St. Paul very clearly says, when a rich person comes in and a poor person comes in, do not treat that rich person with greater value or worth. And why God tells in the Old Testament very clearly, why does God single out the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the alien, the immigrant, is because those persons could not protect themselves. They were the weaker members of society. And this is a uniquely Christian value. Like there's many other world religions, especially the time that Christianity first came about. Most other societies across the world didn't see that they had. Actually, in some societies, like certain branches of Hinduism. They saw that the people who were the lowest rungs of society got what they deserved because they were born into that caste system where that's what they deserve to. Therefore, if you help those people, according to certain sects of Hinduism, you're helping the untouchables and you're creating disorder in society. So so that preferential option for the poor is extremely countercultural in many different societies, but that from the Christian perspective, we have a preferential option to take care of the most vulnerable because otherwise that's where we find inequalities within society is unhealthy and unfair power dynamics where a person who has more is given more and motivated by greed and by gluttony.
Yeah. And some of that also comes from one of the third principles, which is solidarity, that we're as you was talking about the life and dignity that and we've also talked about the equal value that people have is that we recognize that we're one human family, that we're a part of the same, of not just the same race, but we're the same people to a certain extent, and that we're to help each other because of those sorts of things. And of course, the vulnerable we are to take care of, but it doesn't mean that we can discount those who aren't vulnerable at all, like you were saying. I mean, we still have the dignity and value of the one who's on murder's row. The same dignity and value exists there, and part of that comes about because we are a part of this one human family, this one human race.
One of the things that the church teaches and the social encyclicals talk a lot about this, and it is very missing, particularly in the social justice movement, as like a government solution to everything kind of thing. Like, and we're in that both right and left in the United States where, we always think the government needs to fix it.
Right.
While we all know that the government can't fix anything, but
the post office is got a negative debt. I mean, come on. Yeah.
So, but it's this principle of subsidiarity, which I absolutely love, and it's one of the things that I think that the church should do a better job of teaching what we actually believe, which is problems should be solved on the most local level as possible. So, in a sense, if there's a problem in your family, if there's disagreements, you shouldn't have, the governor shouldn't have to be intervening in that, right? It should be solved within the family.
Which is biblical.
Absolutely.
It's biblical. It's when they asked Jesus, how should we solve our problems? He's like, well, deal with it at the smallest level. Go to your brother directly.
Yes.
And then if you can't solve it at that level, bring in three. Bring in your family, right? If you can't solve it there, then you can bring in the church,
right?
So like this note of gradual escalation. If the smaller levels can't solve the problem, then you move to the larger level, which is that's a very simple definition, but that's the definition of subsidiarity.
And it's also the way Moses set up Israel at the time too. Moses was making all these decisions. They was coming to him for all these small things, and his father-in-law was like, "What are you doing? You're going to be doing this all day long. You need to go to lower levels. You need someone over 10 men, over 20 men, over 50 men, So
I'd say this has been a common, and it is a problem, I hope or at least I recognize, in the church of sometimes we've not empowered the laity enough because like everyone comes to the priest and wants the priest to solve their problems or the priest to do this and this and this. And like there's been sometimes this notion, even within the church, where like we've not actually even taught subsidiarity to the laity because the laity are called to predominantly be the where we are feeding into them.
Right. Yeah. Right.
But this notion of like when the priest takes on the role of the laity, also the priest burns out.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you always burn out if you are taking on more than what you can handle.
It kind of goes to as well where we think that somebody should be taking care of this. Yeah. And that's, in a sense, there's certain problems that I myself can't solve. I have someone in front of me and they've got a sick child, they've got a drug addiction, they've got an abusive significant other who's in and out of their life, that there might be legal aspects of that. I can't solve all those problems, like me personally. There's social workers, there's government systems and stuff. But in a sense, like, recognizing that, but there's on the subsidiarity, there's something I can say. Maybe it's just sitting down and having a conversation with that person. Maybe it's just loving them well. I might not even have the means to give them money or give them food, but there's something that I can do, and so what you can do, you should do. There's something as far as loving the poor, loving the person in front of you. Now, does that also involve if you're seeing a problem in society, and you're saying like, man, this keeps coming up? Asking the question, what can we do? Right. It's a dangerous question, and the reason why a lot of people don't ask this question, but those that do, praise God for them, because in a sense, all of a sudden they're recognizing, man, there's ways that we've been doing things that just aren't great and aren't helping, aren't causing human flourishing. And so beginning to ask those questions really brings up some of the things. So it brings up, too, one of the other principles, and there's 7 of these. And the church, again, I can't recommend highly enough the church's social encyclicals that have come through the ages, includes stewardship of creation, includes all sorts of things, but rights and responsibilities. That interplay is such a huge thing, that you have rights, each of us have rights, and out of justice, we're owed those rights.
And boy, everybody's ready to fight for those. Everybody's ready to fight for those rights.
But then you also have responsibilities. That I have a responsibility to society. And so that's, I think, an interesting interplay, because we sometimes contrast kind of, the liberal conservative, and I hate using those categories, but we're in the world that we're in, where it's like, it's kind of the welfare state of this person's poor, so we just give them everything they need, and so they don't end up working, and that's kind of the caricature of that. Come from a family that's been on welfare before, so I've seen the difficulty of being in that sort of circumstance. Then the other side of this is like, it's just about how hard you work, and just you're good in that you work hard and produce something. And the Christian understanding is a much more. It's the interplay between these two extremes, and I think that's you have rights as a human person, and you also have responsibilities to the human family, and so every single person is called to grow in knowledge and awareness of
that. Lots of times that's seen as, I have rights, you have responsibilities.
Yes.
It's not so much.
I have rights, and the government has responsibilities, or the church does.
That point too, when we move away from that subsidiarity. That's exactly what happens. That's the reason why you would rather that be handled on a local level, because once you start getting into it going above, that's when it starts making rules and laws for more generic situations, when in actuality, a lot of this stuff is all very specific and really needs to be handled in particular ways, not in a general way, but more in a particular way.
I think too, and this is a temptation, particularly for a lot of Catholics or Christians who are more conservative, is this automatic rejection of any sort of intervention or work from the government or from nonprofit organizations or anything, and essentially to be like, well, every individual is in charge of themselves. And it's to say, that goes back to the very beginning of the Bible, am I my brother's keeper? And God's response is always yes. Which is not that everything needs to be solved by the church, everything needs to be solved by the government. Please God, no.
Please don't do
but there
that.
needs to be this concern, say, how can we do something? I was brought to that quote, and this is someone who works with the poor in South America, and they brought this up. It might be taken from someone else. Is like, when you feed the poor, they call you a saint. When you ask, why are these people poor? They call you a communist.
Right.
Like to say, why are these people, they continue to be poor? Is there something we could be doing? It's like, whoa there. I'm fine with you doling out soup, but as soon as you start to ask, is there something we could change in the educational system? Or is there something we could, then all of a sudden it becomes, we get sort of uncomfortable with that. So
it's the why question. Why are they poor? That people really don't like to deal with.
It's a very important question. If you've ever dealt, God bless people, my mom works with women in crisis pregnancies, and her and the women that do that sort of work, and women and men, and they experience on a daily basis people who are in broken systems, family systems that have broken down, and it's very rarely that people find themselves in a crisis pregnancy center because everything went right in their life.
Right.
So to ask the question of what can we do upstream a little bit, I think is important. That's what Catholic social teaching helps us to begin to do. It's an art, not a science. There are some scientific aspects, but it is more an art. But it's so important to us, for us. We need people doing both. So it's not like just people legislating, or just people lobbying, or just people working on the grounds with individuals. We need both those people, and both of their insights, I think, are very, very valid.
Yeah, so you're saying, with someone who's poor, it's not only helping them as far as feeding them, but also helping them can be and should be probably, how can we help you not to be in this situation? Not in the sense of we're going to legislate for you, but how can we help you to get out of the situation you're in? And that's the assumption. The assumption you're making is that this person wants to be, and truthfully speaking, I'd say probably 99% of people don't want to be in this situation.
And I'm amazed, and I think recognizing that material poverty is a real thing. It needs to be fought at every level. but the spiritual poverty is always so much greater. So to recognize I can't always solve someone's material needs, but through prayer, through just walking as a disciple, through
fasting
for them, there's a lot that we can do, and I think that's because ultimately I can have all the money and all the food and all the comfort in the world. If I don't have Jesus, I got nothing.
Right.
So if we're helping people, not that we say like, hey, if you want this food, you got to hear my talk about Jesus first. We never want to be like that. And I think Catholics generally do a very good job here in the United States and throughout the world of making sure that we're loving people no matter what. But also not to be afraid to share our faith with them. That's the greatest good. Just as if I have lots of food and someone else has none, I'm obligated as a follower of Jesus to give them food.
Right.
If I've got the bread of life, if I've got Jesus and someone else doesn't, I have to share that with them.
Well, and that's what Mother Teresa said when she came multiple times to the United States, is that she's like, I take care of the poor and those who have no clothing and those who have no food. She said, but never before have I been into a nation where I've seen as much spiritual poverty than when she came to the United States. She's like, never have I seen people with more empty eyes and with more empty souls than in the United States. She's like, I think she actually put in the words of pandemic or of poverty, of spiritual poverty, which I think looking at the absence of mothers and fathers and the structure of the family in the United States, which has been decaying and dissolving, since we bought into certain ideologies. And so I think that also looking systematically at various different things that cause systematic problems with the society. And that's not just reducible to socioeconomics.
Right.
It comes down to the ways in which you define the family structure itself. And it's all, it's like a compound fracture. Like you look at all these different things. So you can say, well, these people are poor because of this. You can also say, well, these people are also poor because of this. And this is and that's where you start getting into very touchy and very sensitive issues, because how you also identify the source of problems is also a huge way in which you're going to analyze and find the solution to problem. Because like Margaret Sanger, for instance, who looked at the source of poverty, she identified the source of poverty as being family size. Right? And therefore the way to solve the problem of poverty is to reduce and to eliminate family size. And this is a classic Planned Parenthood, classic Margaret Sanger how do we bring down poverty is this. But that's what I'm saying, like when you identify the source of poverty as being children.
Right.
And then therefore the way that you do this is by just eliminating family size, getting down into more. And that's going to has that actually solve the problem? Has that solved the problem of poverty and things like that? So that's where you get into getting complex things, because like how you identify what your issue is also what your solution could be. And if you misidentify the source of poverty, right? Because we have lots of different things, you're going to have major problems, which will then create cyclical cycles of even greater poverty.
And this kind of brings up two other things as well, like the dignity and rights of workers. People being able to work in good conditions. That's what's a lot of the Rerum Novarum and a lot of the Marxist things came out of those horrific conditions of workers. So recognizing too that's something we should always be in favor of the worker, but also too that people. Like private property is a good thing, not as something that I just hold to myself selfishly, but that becomes a gift. The difference between the early church, where they took everything they had, they put it at the feet of the apostles, and they gave it all to the poor, no one wanted, between that and communism, is one came from freedom and the other came from, communism comes from the gun, right? So it's all the difference in the world.
And also that system didn't last very long in the church.
That's true,
It's kind of a naive idealistic.
The good old days.
And then they're like, oh, no, this is not working really well.
A year after Jesus' ascension, like, remember the good old days? When we were, the early church.
The early church. That's right, the early church.
But then also too, recognizing the family. And this is where kind of the connection, and this is that societies definitely have moved away from it, and the society's understanding of social justice, that sexual morality is tied to social justice and in society, because most of society's ills, and modern sociologists will talk about this, have to do with people growing up without fathers. That's the number one indicator imprisonment, of getting pregnant out of wedlock. The number is not having a father in the house. So in a sense,
type of job you have, all that stuff.
Yeah, all those sorts of things. So to recognize that the church's moral teachings, and this is maybe where the church is unique in this, because a lot of people work very hard towards the rights of the poor, the rights of prisoners. A lot of NGOs or other organizations. The church is the only place that brings together that personal morality and social morality kind of together, and to recognize, like, if you don't have one, the other's going to fall. So it's a both and rather than either or. So I wanted to kind of point this out too, because I think this is maybe where a lot of the people's suspicion towards social justice, language kind of comes in, is how society's kind of has been fractured, and so virtues get sort of splintered off from one another, and those can become kind of destructive elements. So, Father Tom, you had an old Jewish proverb that I think was apropos to this.
There's an old story from I think it's the city of Prague, which is called the story of the golem, which actually is kind of funny because there's a Jewish word for goyim, which means brainless lump of clay. So it's like a dumb person, a stupid person, which is kind of a slur which sometimes is used in Jewish circles. But there's the story of the golem, which is a clay man, a person with no brain, or it's actually a mythological creature. And so there's this story of the golem, which is that a time where I believe it is Prague was under attack, that they asked this rabbi to help them to defend the city. And so he was like, well, okay, I'm going to create a golem. So he creates this golem. But in the golem, what he does is, so he takes clay, he shapes it into, and then he takes the magical words from Scripture, which is the word for life, which is emet, E-M-E-T. And he writes emet, which from Jewish mysticism, like language is magical, or language is kind of power. It's the power of God. It's using the power of God. So they write truth, emet, upon the golem's chest or upon his forehead. Then all of a sudden the golem goes out and destroys all their enemies, but the problem is that when you do things like that, the golem is also brainless and has no brain. It just becomes a raging beast and starts to destroy the city. Mm-hmm. So actually in the story, the rabbi has to go in, he actually sacrificed himself by removing one letter, the first letter from emet, and removes that letter from the name from emet, from truth. And therefore then you are left from emet to met, M-E-T, which is the word for death. Mm. And the moral of the story, I mean, it's obviously a fantastical story, but the moral of the story is that you remove one letter of the truth can be destructive. But if you remove one letter of the truth, then you don't have the whole truth, you have only a partial truth. And the partial truth will lead to death.
Yes.
Which is what the notion is. It's you can't have the full truth. And that's why as you take the gospel message, or you take all the virtues, and you start to remove certain virtues from each other, and you isolate and separate them, you divide them, you create schisms. And that's also why the church in the New Testament, especially St. Paul, talks about do not allow schisms, do not allow things to divide you, don't take. And you can't champion this cause over here and become a person who champions this unless you're willing to, you have to accept the whole gospel.
Yes.
Because if you don't take the whole gospel eventually, if you only have fragments and pieces of the gospel, that will lead you to death.
I think a great example of this is, I mean, you could take tons of examples, is one of the principles of Catholic social teaching is care for creation, stewardship of creation. That's amazing and beautiful and an important thing for us to recognize. We have this amazing earth that is our home. Yeah. It's not our final home, but that we're called to care for it, called to protect it and steward it. But when that virtue or that principle is removed from the dignity of the human person, from God's creation, from our ultimate end in God, the beatific vision that we're made for, from sexual morality, from all these things, all of a sudden now you get people who this golem unleashed, that they're in favor of the environment, but they're willing to sacrifice children. Yeah. You have people that are basically saying, in order to care for the environment, we need to enforce abortion and sterilization in developing countries. And that's not a principle. That's not some mad scientist. That is an accepted policy from many NGOs, from worldwide organizations, from the United Nations and other ones as well, that basically say, again, for the sake of creation, for the sake of nature, which is a good thing, but once it's been cut off from, it becomes death. And I think that's the same. So if my whole thing is the rights of workers, and that's all I care about, the rights of workers, then all of a sudden I can become deceptive, I can become manipulative, I can become all these things for the sake of these workers. So they always have to be held in tension with one another. And I think that's something that we're not really good at. We're good at seeing there's a problem here, and I'm going to focus in on that, but being able to allow ourselves to be challenged by it. Yeah, but there are also
and this is why you can't have true justice unless you have wisdom.
Right.
Because justice is black and white. It's black and white, it's simple, but that's why justice has to have wisdom. That's why, to a certain extent, you can't have the virtue of justice unless you also have prudence.
Yeah.
And so, that's why God is not just a God of justice. He's also a God of wisdom. And that's why justice must flow into wisdom. And that's why many people can do things which they believe to be right. But there's also there's a wider, that's why wisdom opens you up to a wider perspective than just your own narrow perspective.
So why don't we kind of, hopefully this gives people a little bit better understanding of when we talk about social justice in the Catholic sense, that it's not the world's understanding of social justice, but Catholic social teaching rooted in the biblical narrative, rooted in our response to the changing world. And we're in a changing world too. The world is, globalization and technologies that are still coming, AI, all these things are going to continue to challenge us to figure out what are we rooted in. But I think these principles give us a good way forward. So maybe we can kind of just say, just sort of in closing, what's one thing that we can be doing as maybe a book from the Bible to read, or just something to embody. And I'll start just thinking there's a compendium of Catholic social teaching, which is fantastic, and it gives a great breakdown of these. It's rooted in obviously the biblical narrative, but also to it kind of brings together all the teachings of the popes from the past 130 years almost. Yeah. So that would be a great thing for people to check out. The U.S. bishops have that on their website. But a great resource, something too, if this interests you to maybe begin to discuss as well.
Yeah. I was going to say to kind of read about these principles. I mean, there's places that you can go and read about these 7 principles of the Catholic Church on social justice, social teaching, and to educate yourself on how these things kind of fit together. Because it's one thing. We always tell people to think before you act, and so and lots of times when people act, they act without that wisdom that we were talking about, and without knowledge. And so to equip themselves to read what you were talking about, and then maybe to really be able to study these 7 principles and see how they fit together specifically with Scripture, and specifically how they fit together in my life.
I'd say, just taking to prayer, because sometimes we got to take some of these things to prayer and pray about them, but also be open in humility. And that's one of the greatest virtues that we can actually have, which actually will place all the other virtues into their proper relation is humility. God came into the world to show us humility. Mary shows us humility. Like God asked from us, He's okay with us being imperfect as long as we can be humble. But I think that also in humility, recognizing where do I need to grow, and also where am I looking for salvation? And also listening to people and understanding we hear this colloquially said in the church so much as, are you saved? But what am I looking to be saved from, as well as where do I place my hope for salvation? Yeah. And I'm saying what do I want to be saved from in the world? Am I expecting the Republican Party to save me?
Yeah.
Am I expecting the Democratic Party? Am I expecting a platform? Am I expecting communism, or am I expecting capitalism, or am I expecting these are going to solve the problems in the world? So allowing in self-reflection, what is my thoughts? Where am I looking for salvation? Where am I looking to solve the problems in the world? Because that's where I think our Lord is inviting us to look, and to not direct our gaze to any of these things which are smaller. We need to look to the highest thing.
Absolutely.
And that's looking to God, looking to our Father, looking to Christ, looking to Him. Because if we look to Him, all the other things will flow. And God wants to give us actually all the virtues, but that we can only receive all of them when we first recognize, where am I looking to, where's my Messiah?
And I would just add one last thing, which is, to think about what I can do. You know, I think sometimes we begin to look at what other people can do or what other institutions can do. Maybe even sometimes we criticize the church for what the church ought to be doing or should be doing. And, you know, to really look inwardly and to say, you know, what can I do for the people around me? So, okay, so maybe I don't know that many people who are in actual poverty, but do I know someone who needs something? Do I know someone who would benefit from something that I have that maybe I need, or maybe I don't even need? But how can I begin to live this out in my life, just with the people around me, the community around me? Because there's so much that can be done just in your sphere, you know, in your sphere of influence.
Yeah.
That can actually happen. And so, because lots of times we start thinking outside of that, and we start looking at all these big issues, and we become overwhelmed, and we ask, what can I do? Little old me, what can I do? And I think going back to St. Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa herself, she says, you know, if you really want to make a difference in the world, go home and love your family. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where it starts. That's how you start doing that. Love the person next to you.
Yeah, but please don't get out and go into a march.
Right.
Don't march for any cause if you're treating your family like crap.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, and it's a again, for anyone who's been watching this, particularly anyone who like bristled at Catholics or social justice as a theme, like on the face. I'm so glad for you watching this. Hopefully this conversation is helpful, and I think it's a great conviction and challenge for each one of us. So awesome conversation, Father Tom, Father Doug. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. Hopefully you're liking these videos and sharing them and subscribing and supporting us on Patreon. We can't say enough thanks to you for allowing us to do this, allowing us to share this message with others. We hope you guys are praying for us. We're praying for you, and we'll see you next time on Catholic in America.